What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muster Room Podcast. Today is a very special day, special podcast, the first ever Muster Room on the road, as we'll call it. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, you can see exactly where we are. We are on a boat, a very special boat that we're going to get into momentarily. Beautiful scenery. We're here in New York City, Pier 66A in Manhattan. We have the Freedom Tower directly to my left. We're sitting here in the Hudson River on the harbor. And we are joined by a very special person who has an unbelievable backstory specific to September 11th. But Jess, you have a lifelong, multiple careers of different things.
Yes.
So let's kind of go over your resume. Who are you? Why are you here on the Muster Room? And then let's roll into why this boat is so special. So for those of you who are listening and watching, we are on this very large 130-foot decommissioned FD&Y boat. Yes. So if you guys hear creaking or the wind or helicopters, sirens, whatever, we are outside on this ship. So forgive the background noise, but then let it be soothing to you as well. So Jess, go ahead. Tell us who you are and a little bit about yourself and your resume.
Sure. I refuse to give you my whole resume. it's too long and complicated. But so the reason why we're here is because I am I love saying this, Chief Engineer Emerita of Fireboat John J. Harvey. So I served aboard the boat for 2 decades. I was working I basically came up, they call you a hawse piper if you don't take the school path to getting trained as an engineer. So I basically did an apprenticeship, like a hands-on apprenticeship, and came up through the ranks and spent the last 11 years aboard this boat as chief. And now I'm very happy to be retired.
You've told us multiple times since being on this boat, you're extremely happy. You served about 20 years though, right?
Yes.
Just under 20 years.
Yeah.
But just to paint the picture, you've done a lot more than just this boat. Now I know you don't want to get too much into it, but just give us a little backstory about who you are as a person.
Sure. So I actually wrote a lot about this in my first book called My River Chronicles. And it's basically about how I was raised in this family that really respected and honored machinery and equipment. And my dad's a mechanic for Porsches and other German machines, as they're called in my family. And that respect for craftsmanship and equipment and functionality being beautiful, like when it's done really, really well, when it's going to work really, really well, it's also beautiful. And so that was sort of how I was raised. So coming aboard the fireboat, I was just completely consumed. I mean, I came down by accident. I've told the story a lot of times, but basically I was working as a .commer. My other secret life, which is not so secret, is that I'm a journalist and I am an author, and I'm now doing a lot of work as a book collaborator, so helping other people manifest their books. And I do a lot of work with people coping with trauma and do a lot of work about grief and trauma, and I think that might be part of why I'm here too.
Well, that's how we got connected, right? So a quick shout out to Billy Gibbons.
Yes.
Billy is a good friend of ours. We've known him through our Law Enforcement Officers Weekend organization. He supported the nonprofit helping with the families of the injured and fallen officers. He designs and develops really badass armor equipment, right? So Armor Upfitters is his business name and the website. And Billy had reached out to me and said, hey, listen, I know you have this podcast. There's somebody really special you should meet. And he connected us via email. And then he or you sent over a little description about yourself and the fireboat. It may have been Billy.
Yeah, probably was him.
And I was like, wow, this is awesome. And right before Billy had sent that to myself, Joe and I were talking about doing a 9/11 series, being that it's coming up when this episode airs. It's going to be the end of August, rolling into September for the 21st anniversary of September 11th. So we figured there's so many different stories out there. How can we just pick one for the podcast? You can't. So we lined up about 4 different individuals who we're going to be interviewing over the next few weeks, which will air between the end of August through all of September. And it's going to be our 9/11 series.
Awesome.
And there's all these different stories that some people may have heard, and most likely most haven't.
Yeah.
My father actually brought it up the other day. He was talking to me about the next podcast, and I was telling him specifically about this one.
Okay.
And he said, that's so cool. You're going to be on this boat that's over 70 years old, and there's a children's book written about it, but no one really knows about it. I only know about it because you told me that.
Oh, really?
Right, yeah. So when I was telling my dad that, he goes, how come people don't know these stories?
Right.
September 11th was probably the biggest news story in our time, right? In our history. Probably, I would assume it was probably relatable to Pearl Harbor back in the 40s, right? Or 30s, excuse me. So if 9/11 was such a big story and all of these amazing rescues occurred, and I don't want to give away the story of this boat, but this boat did some really amazing things. Why wasn't that told enough times, especially outside of the first responder community? And I said, Dad, I don't have an answer for you. I don't know. Yeah. And I think that's why this podcast essentially exists. We're trying to tell these stories of injured officers or injured first responders, speaking with the families of fallen first responders, and then we have these special episodes like this, where we're telling a story where most people don't know it.
Right.
And I think they're going to be really interested in it once we actually get into it. I've been telling a lot of people at work about it, and every single person I told was like, they had no idea. And by the way, they're all first responders. Yeah. They're all NYPD. They've all been affected by 9/11 in some way, shape, or form.
Sure.
But they never heard about this story. They never heard about a lot of those stories. Yeah. So I'm super excited to get into this and to get into the other episodes over the next few weeks. Yeah. So again, this is the first official episode for our 9/11 series that we'll probably do every year moving forward. It's unfortunate that we have to do it, but we have to tell these stories, because if we don't, we've probably all seen it already. The younger generation, they don't really know about 9/11.
Sure.
I see jokes online on social media about 9/11 from, these young 16, 17-year-old kids who weren't alive when the towers came down, when the Pentagon got hit. So I think we have to continuously tell these stories, and that's kind of what this boat does, right? So it's a floating museum. But and I'm going to let you kind of get into all that. So with that being said, I think it's a perfect transition. Let's get into it. Let's get into the story of this boat, and then how you essentially operated as a civilian helping out the FDNY from September 12th, 2001 onward. But this boat had been in service since 1931, correct? Yes. With the FDNY. So tell us all about the boat and how it was designed. You're an engineer. You could do way better than I can on describing what this boat actually is.
So this boat, built in 1931, and she was the first internal combustion fireboat. So she set the standard for all fireboats to come. And everything before that was steam driven. And the boat was very much designed for the harbor as it existed then. Very, very different from what we see in New York today. I'm not sure how much you can see here, but actually you can see a finger pier, right sure. over there. So basically, back in the day, as it were, the entire shoreline of Manhattan was covered with these finger piers. Almost looked like a comb, right, with all of these little jagged edges sticking out. And with those finger piers, if you actually did the math, it was 76 miles of usable frontage. And all of this was in a time where there was break bulk cargo. So break bulk cargo means, it wasn't a bunch of rubber duckies in a single container, all the things the same, right? That you pick up like a Lego, and move to a ship through a container and all that stuff. Instead, it was very much all handled by hand. So all different kinds of mixed kinds of cargo were all put together. The story I tell at the beginning of my first book, I talk about how this boat was actually named after a pilot, FDNY pilot. So that's the person who steers the boat in the fire department. Because you can't call him a captain, because FDNY, that's a whole other thing, right? Yep. So pilot is the person steering the boat, and John J. Harvey actually was killed in action. Okay. And he was killed in action as the pilot of the boat, and that's where the boat was named. But there were these just vicious, common fires all in the harbor. And it was because you'd have stuff like shellac and, newsprint and,
fire code back then was pretty non-existent. Yeah.
Full on, right? Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the fact that this is internal combustion is that it was originally a gasoline electric boat, not a diesel electric boat, which meant that you're like taking a whole bunch of gas vapor to a big fire. Right. And so she was converted in 1957, which is a very wise move, but they had good strategies for dealing to make sure that the vapor head was, was kept to a low danger threat level while they were reporting. But the boat is just this absolute marvel of craftsmanship. And the way that she was built is just to me, it's still breathtaking after all these years. And after so many hours on this boat in every nook and cranny you can imagine in some very ugly places.
Yeah, I'm sure.
In the shipyard and out. And but the boat was designed with this incredible redundancy so that if you're fighting a pier fire, and there were these big pier sheds, basically, and there's the helicopters.
There's the helicopter. You're going to hear that a lot throughout the podcast.
But that just lets you know that it's real. It's not
real.
just like a virtual Zoom screen.
No, this is happening.
So these major fires were happening, and this boat had to be able to stay on station while pumping a shit ton of water onto these, to be able to blast through walls, basically, in the pier shed to be able to put out fires. So what that meant was she was built with this really remarkable redundancy so that I can swap over engines in different configurations, all port side, all starboard side, half and half in the middle. And there are 4 engines that serve both for propulsion and for pumping. Mm-hmm. And so that just means you have a lot of choices. And for an emergency services vessel, it was really important. So this was a remarkable boat when she was built.
So the cops that are listening right now and the EMTs, they're like, what the hell is she talking about?
Sorry.
But the firefighters that are listening right now are going bananas, right? They know exactly what you're talking about, especially those who work on the engine. They know exactly what you're saying. I was a volunteer firefighter myself for about almost 15 years. Joe was a volunteer. Joe, how long were you a volunteer firefighter for?
About 7 years.
About 7 years. He was also a critical care technician. I'm still an EMT. So although we're both law enforcement, we still respect the thin red line.
Right.
And we, whether you're a volunteer or a professional, most of them go through essentially the same beginning training. Yep. And you learn about the engine and how it operates. And there's drafting, especially. I'm from the City of Long Beach Fire Department, where I served for about 15 years. So we had learned how to essentially pump water from either the ocean or the bay,
right,
through the engine to a fire.
Yeah.
I never had to do it personally, but I know there have been times where they did.
Sure.
So that's essentially what this is, right? And you said back in the day, this was actually called an engine, right? This boat was an engine.
It was an engine company. I think it was Engine Company 57. Mm-hmm. And so it was just there. The need for these boats was just really, it's hard to translate it now,
right?
Because we are living in a Manhattan or visiting a Manhattan that is so completely changed.
Yeah.
And especially after a period where people got completely detached from the sense of the waterfront. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were decades where people were like, oh, waterfront, don't go there, it's rats. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And everybody turned their back on the waterfront. Now, at least, there's a connection because there's this sense of like recreation and,
wealth,
park and wealth. And, everything sparkly and shiny. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you, as we will get to later, the fact that the shoreline was outfitted for a passive view of the river and not a connection to the waterways actually had life or death consequences on September 11th.
Right, yeah. And that's really the reason why we're here, is to really speak of that story.
Yeah.
And it's so intense. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But I want to talk more about the boat itself, because this boat is so special. I mean, it is so special, right? Yeah. This boat, essentially every other FDNY boat following the design of this one was essentially created because of this boat, right? They used this design moving forward. Yeah,
I mean, obviously changes were made, and I will say that materials were downgraded, right? U.S. steel is,
right, yeah.
Or not even U.S. steel, but steel quality is diminished. But the reason why this boat was able to do her job and do her service to the city for so many years was because we have brass and bronze equipment where you wouldn't have that today.
Right.
And so you're pumping salt water all over yourself all day long, right? That's the gig. And that's what this is. It's basically a floating pump. Right? That you can bring on site. And so it's interesting because a lot of firefighters don't have that shoreline connection that you do, and understand you're going to go to the endless supply of water. That is really valuable. And I'll tell you, that changed everything in Lower Manhattan.
So speaking of which, how much water can this fireboat actually pump a minute?
18,000 gallons per minute.
Wow.
Yeah. When everything's working. And, she's an old lady.
She is. And so she's over 80 years old now.
Let's see. So the boat was built in 1931.
Mm-hmm.
So
90.
Yeah.
90 years old.
Yeah. So the boat has been in service to her city in some iteration for decade after decade, and seen so many different changes happen.
There's not too many objects, right? Not just boats, but cars, planes, objects that you could say is still functioning at 90 plus years old. this
True.
boat still is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a testament to its design to begin with.
Absolutely. And the materials and the craftsmanship and the attention. And, and it's funny because we say that, but the fact is that the boat, I think it's that the first rivet was driven in October and the boat was launched in December or something like that. It's like absurdly quick.
So in about 2.5 months, this boat was built.
Crazy.
Right.
And that's the way that we could do things then.
It's because there wasn't social media. People weren't checking their Facebook while building the boat, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. There was no Twitter.
Yeah,
that is
that's
really
what it
the
was.
reason.
Yeah, that's
really
it.
the reason.
Nothing else. Just because social media. So how long was this boat actually in service for the FDNY?
So let's see. So the boat was launched in 1931, and actually there's this great picture of the boat showing off her very powerful pumps right in front of the George Washington Bridge, which only was a single roadway at the time.
Oh, wow.
Which was really cool
Yeah.
to see, like to really put the time in perspective.
It still is a single roadway with all the construction that's going on.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. Or it is again, right?
Yeah.
And again and again.
Yeah.
And so, and then she served the city through 1995, I believe it was when she was put into reserve status. And then in 1999, it's been a little while, I think it was 1999, the boat was sold at a scrap auction. And so basically the idea was it was just scrap. This was scrap metal that needed to be chopped up and turned into, Toyotas or something, right? And the purchasers, the people who ended up being trustees on the boat, bought the boat, and they were like very closely almost outbid. And they soon realized that they had this historic treasure, and since that point, it's been this historic preservation project that has had. I mean, it would not even be possible to tally the amount of volunteer hours. I almost said volunteer love that has gone into this boat.
That's what it is, right?
It really is. I mean, so many people and I used to spend almost every weekend I used to spend down here, even after working during the week, and fixing stuff, getting it done, welding, painting, whatever needed to be done, and a whole lot of engine work, of course.
I keep saying how special this boat is, and our co-host Eric Potts, who's typically here with us, unfortunately couldn't make it, and he's super bummed. I mean, he was really looking forward to being here. So shout out to Eric. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it, but maybe we'll try to get back on the boat with you.
Yeah.
So essentially, this boat served the city of New York as an FDNY fireboat for over 40 years. Just to put that into perspective, a typical fire truck, right? A ladder truck and engine, really only in
over
service
60 years, Austin.
Yes. So that's why I'm a police officer, first off, because I can't do math, okay? That's why I'm not an engineer.
And it's my job to not correct people when I'm on a podcast.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But in your mind, you're like, this is a fucking idiot.
No.
So over 60 years serving the city of New York as a piece of firefighting apparatus.
Yes.
A typical engine, typical ladder truck may only serve the city, not just anywhere, if you're lucky, 10 to 20 years at most. And this boat was serving for 60 years.
60 years in a saltwater environment, too.
Yeah.
It's a steel boat, right?
Yeah.
And, riveted hull. I mean, it's remarkable. It really is remarkable because, from the day it's launched, it's trying to sink. We know this, right?
Right,
and this one's also trying to melt.
Yeah.
Because the salt and the steel are not good friends.
So
how big of a crew did she have?
That is a good question. Let me think. Okay, so there's all sorts of really interesting stories about how the boat was kept warm, like 80 degrees in the engine room in the middle of winter, so that you could, fire things off really quickly. Emergency services, right? And I know that. So there's a bunk room that we can go to, like the crew's quarters. That I believe. So there was certainly an oiler. I believe there was a chief and an engineer. So I think 3 people down below, and hopefully someone will hear this and give me the real answer and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'd love to know. And then the pilot, for sure. And then you need deck crew and you need firefighters. Right. So I mean, it's a lot of people. It's a big boat. And my understanding is that the engineering crew stayed on board so that they could be at the ready at a moment's notice, and that the pilot and the firefighters stayed in the firehouse.
Okay.
I think.
How many deck guns are there on this boat?
Oh my God. Okay. So you have the one big, so first off, distinction, right? There are deck guns, but then there are also turrets that are available for connecting hose lines too.
Oh, so not a 50 cal machine gun, not a turret like that.
Not that kind of
That'd
turret.
be awesome.
A different kind of, that would be a whole different gig. Yeah, but I mean, the water is pretty powerful. I wouldn't get
That's
in front
true.
of that
Yeah,
either. You know, I mean, I think that there are some legit stories. You know, you never know what is a fishing story, but of the pressure. I mean, the pressure coming out is pretty intense,
Oh, sure,
and
yeah.
like breaking down concrete walls
Yeah,
and things
yeah.
like that. So you have. I wish we were like now walking around so I could show you everything. But you have.
Well, we're going to show. So for those who are watching on
Yeah.
YouTube, we're gonna cut to different photos and live shots
okay,
of us
while
walking
we're doing
around.
that?
Yeah, so
Excellent,
they'll see what
excellent.
we're talking about.
Okay, all right. So then maybe I'll try to explain it in that sort of way. Hold
Sure.
on, let's see. So, well, we'll talk about the pumps when we're in the engine room, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so you have these two aft turrets with deck guns on them. You will have a very strong bow pipe, but then you also have a deck monitor, or, fire pump, whatever you want to call it, deck pipes or monitor up on the wheelhouse as well. And so you have this dispersed firefighting capability.
Right. So 360.
And they're all spinnable,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably, that's probably not the technical term, but like you could.
I think it is.
I spent all my time in the engine room. Really, like, this is hard.
Remember, I said
I'm
40. I said
hard-pressed.
40 years when it was really 60. So spinnable sounds like the proper
Spinnable.
word for me.
Yeah, they rotate and they can pivot, and I'm like moving my hand around, which is not going to help the people in the podcast, but like they can move up and down and around, right? And so that what that means is that you can really adapt to the circumstances and address it head on.
Right, because what you have to, because a fire is a living, breathing thing,
Yes.
right? So,
Yeah.
and it could change at a moment's notice. A slight shift of wind can completely change.
And where are you? You're talking about on the waterfront,
Right.
right? So it's like, it's not a calm, lack of windy area.
No, I'm sure people could hear the wind right now.
Yes.
With these microphones. So,
Yes, probably.
yeah. So it serves the city all the way up till about 1995 when it becomes a reserve piece of apparatus, and then still serves for another 4 to 5 years. 1999 hits, it then becomes decommissioned. Your organization then essentially takes it over and makes it into a living, floating museum.
Yeah, a living museum, definitely. And just to be fair, like, I wasn't involved at that point,
Right.
and I came on board in, oh God, what was it? It was year 2000, I think. Does that make sense? Because I was only on board for 6 months before September 11th happened. So no, actually, it must
So
have been
early
February
2001?
21.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2021. Or no, not 2021, 2001. That was last year.
Yeah.
It's all one big COVID blur. Yes. So the initial crew, as you said earlier when we were talking, it was still very much it wasn't an established team.
Right.
You know what I mean? Where you
You're
get
still
that,
learning
like,
the boat.
Yeah, everybody was still learning the boat.
And you guys weren't firefighters taking over the boat.
No.
So it was learning a whole new system for you guys.
Yeah. So to be fair,
Need a drink, Joe.
It's been a long
Let's
day.
do a little drink. Sip.
so there were people who were volunteer firefighters who were involved in the boat from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So the person who I came up with, who basically I did an apprenticeship with, was Tim Ivory, and he had been a volley for years in New Jersey and had also worked on boats and in boats and under boats and every configuration you can think of. And he's really the one who came in and deciphered what was happening in the engine room and how to make it go.
Right.
And so he was there from the very beginning. I didn't join until that February. Yeah, that's when it was. And also, as things moved on, there are plenty of FDNY and other companies, firefighters who have since become involved. But at that moment, at that time, that early time, everybody was pretty much a novice, with one exception, which was Bob Lenny, who made me so sad when you said, "Hey, can we interview Bob?" And I was like, "Oh my God, what I would give to just sit down with him and drink some Coronas."
Yeah.
Because I miss him just so terribly. But he was a career firefighter with a very long history. He was in the Merchant Marine before that. But he piloted this boat, and he retired and she retired, and then they were reunited in retirement. And so he played a huge, huge role in the vessel,
Right.
pretty early on.
For that short amount of time between it being actually decommissioned to September 11th. So for that year and a half or so, being that it was a museum, I'm assuming you brought a lot of kids onto the boat. You're kind of showing them what this fireboat did, and can you kind of just explain what you would do for the civilian population and how this boat kind of taught them the ways of the water?
Yeah. So I'll tell you the real story, which was at that age of the project, it was so formative, so rudimentary. Like we basically went on a camping trip up to Albany. You know what I mean? It was very much like people connected to the boat would invite their friends out. It was a lot of cocktail parties. It wasn't. We were still learning about the treasure that this boat is, and just everyone was just sort of giddy with the, because Bob's big thing was like, it's not yours because you can't take it fishing, and everyone was like, oh, let's take it fishing,
Yeah.
So in the early days, that was really kind of the focus. Although to be perfectly honest, I spent every minute down below. That was my home. That was so people, whatever they were doing up here, I don't know. I didn't care. I was just madly in love with learning everything I could about the engine room. And really but there were some ideas about, people are starting to get the picture. There's a historian of FDNY and lots of things maritime, Al Jordanowitz, who really played a huge role in educating the team. I'm wondering what that is.
That's the water hitting the side of the hull. There's some larger boats passing by.
Oh, is that what happened?
Yeah.
See, I'm facing away from it.
You don't see what's going on. So we have a lot of the New York waterway taxis that are passing by.
Because it's rush hour.
It's rush hour.
Totally, yes.
And we also have, it looked like I don't know if it was a fishing charter or it might have been one of those booze cruise boats that was just drove by a little while ago. So
like a circle line kind of thing?
Yeah, I think we're finally getting the wake from that boat that just went by.
Got it. All right. It sounds very strange over headphones.
Yeah.
Not as I'm
No zoom here, folks.
No. This is
no
all real.
virtual background, right? So what the hell was I saying? I was saying that so it was really just the beginning of understanding really what this artifact is and what it was capable of, because system after system was getting back fired up because of the incredible work of Tim Ivory, and then you have Al Jordanowitz, who's basically putting into historical context the contribution that this boat made throughout history, and so there's this burgeoning recognition of the precious, object that we had to take care of. And then if there was any question at all, it really solidified things in September.
So then,
if we get to September, what were you doing in the morning of September 11th? How did you find out about the attacks?
So I found out about the attacks. So I was... At the time, I was also working as a freelance journalist, so I would juggle my time. And actually, I did a whole bunch of writing, drafting, and stuff like that on board this boat. I did interviews when we went on trips. I, always doing tag teaming to get both things done. But so I was at my desk and I was checking email and I was looking at photographs of the trip that we had just returned from. In Albany, because it was the first time that we had all really come together. I mean, we basically lived together for, what was it? I don't even know. Felt like 15 years, but I think it was 5 days. And I remember we all stood up on one of the turrets and took this picture. And I remember, I think I even said it out loud, I wonder if we'll still like each other this much by the end, right? And it turned out we did. And that we were still coming off that high and that connection, that when that moment of camaraderie happens. And so that's the place that I was. And honestly, it's really blurry exactly how it happened. But I think I got a phone call, and then I didn't really have a TV. I had this like someone had left it in the apartment or something like that and tried to turn it on. There was no service. And I just sort of stumbled finding out. And then I did what so many people did that day. They wandered around. I was in Brooklyn, so all the bridges and tunnels were shut down. And I wandered around trying to give blood. And I remember this moment where I went up to a hospital that's pretty close to my neighborhood. And I saw this police officer and I was like, what can I do? I want to help. What can I do? And he looked at me and it was just this that stare that's full of emotion, but also blank at the same time? It was that, right? And he looked at me and he's like, they don't know what to do with me. And I looked at him in uniform and I was like, I've got nothing. I can contribute nothing. And it was a horrible feeling. I mean, it was really, and I remember seeing some, I guess one channel started coming in, and there were these news broadcasts of people who were making stretchers, that of course, as we know, like never got used.
No need for them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh my God, I couldn't fucking stand it.
Yeah.
I really couldn't stand it. And I was so new to the boat that it just didn't click. Whereas all the mariners that I interviewed for my book, Saved at the Seawall, who all participated in the boat lift, they knew exactly where to go, knew exactly what to do. I was still green, So finally the next morning, on the 12th.
I don't want to get into the 12th just yet.
Okay. Sorry.
Because I still, so speaking of your book, Saved at the Seawall, I want to say a decent amount of people in New York probably know of the unbelievable rescue operation, really, that occurred taking people out of Lower Manhattan and bringing them to New Jersey. I mean, we're talking tens, if not, probably tens of thousands of people, right?
Hundreds of thousands
of people that had to be evacuated out of Lower Manhattan following the collapse of both towers. And they were stranded, nowhere to go. Like you said, the bridges were shut down.
Yes.
People were still walking across the bridges, but there was so much dust and the fires that were still raging.
Yes.
You still had buildings that were coming down, right? World Trade Center 7 came down a little while afterwards. So all these civilian boats went and started evacuating Lower Manhattan.
Yes.
And there's a really amazing documentary that has been released. I think actually multiple documentaries now have come out on Netflix and on YouTube, where they interview a lot of these boat pilots who at first really just took it into their own hands. There was no like alert that went out saying, hey, we need to evacuate Lower Manhattan. People just started doing it on their own.
Yeah.
Self-dispatching, as we say in the first responder field, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually, I think the Coast Guard got notice of what was happening, and the Coast Guard officially actually put out a request and said, really, any civilian boat anywhere in the vicinity of Lower Manhattan, head to X location. We're going to line you guys up and we're going to start evacuating Lower Manhattan, right? Tell us about your book and tell us about what this boat was doing on September 11th.
Okay. So on September 11th, what happened was one of the trustees of the boat, Chase Wells, immediately was on the phone with FDNY trying to dispatch and trying to figure out like, hey, we have this boat, can we come and help? And, nobody knew anything, right? It was just this like complete void of communication. And as we know, in the after report, we get to see exactly why there was so little information. And finally, I think it was basically, finally, it was just sort of like an acquiescence of just like, sure, go down there. I mean, what the hell, right? So he rallied Huntley Gill. He rallied Tim Ivory, who was the person who could make the boat go. There were a couple people who ended up converging on the boat spontaneously. Andrew Ferber, Thomas, a few other people who ended up serving on the boat, who just ended up here and then shot south. So they shot south, and by that point, I'm pretty sure the first tower was already down. And obviously that's well into the boat lift, which really happened immediately. I mean, the maritime participation in bringing people off of Manhattan, not just Lower Manhattan, but all the way up Manhattan, happened instantaneously, basically within a minute. And we can get into the details, which is, I think, really remarkable. And that's part of the story that hasn't been told.
Yeah, let's get into those details, actually, because I think that's a huge part of the story.
Yeah, it really is. And so, so early on, basically, you're talking about within 1 minute of the first plane hitting, which by many people's accounts in that moment was just an accident, right?
Yeah.
People were like, small plane, it was an accident. Even in that circumstance, it was a total emergency, obviously, that only got worse and worse, of course. But in that moment, it was already an emergency. And it was a transportation emergency. And within a minute, you had a MTA employee reroute and not drop off passengers at a site a station that was down there.
So we're talking about a bus.
No, it was I think it was a PATH train or a subway train.
Oh, okay,
so underground, basically, understanding that something's happening and just took passengers back to New Jersey. I think it must have been a PATH train.
Okay.
But MTA also responded really, really quickly. And so the other people who responded really, really quickly are the people who could actually see what the fuck is going on, right? Ferry captains. So the ferry captains, as we're getting the wakes, right, back and forth.
And the helicopter.
So the ferries were already doing their workaday thing, right? Over and back, over and back. That's what they do. And that over and back is actually really important because to break away to self-dispatch, as you said, is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Right? It's like minute to minute.
It's mainly shunned upon for most aspects of the response aspect of emergency management.
Yes, right? This whole thing was a self-dispatch and it worked brilliantly.
Right.
We are talking about by the end of the day, and I'm not to cut to the finish line, but like by the end of the day, you're talking about minimum 400,000 people, 400,000, almost, and it may be as many as 500,000 people moved off of Manhattan to Brooklyn, Staten Island, New Jersey, all these different places.
All via boat?
All via boat.
So I saw these documentaries. It's probably been a year or two since I last seen it. You know, they come up every now and then, especially during, you know, the month of September, but I'm still getting chills just thinking about how many people these boats moved. The amount of manpower to do that. Because I mean, these are big boats, but they only could hold so many people.
Yeah, well, you also have the Staten Island ferry that's contributing, and that boat can just carry those boats.
400,000 people.
That's how rapidly it was happening. That's how quickly people respond. And it started, like I said, from the minute, because I have multiple ferry captains who were like, I immediately, like, I did not call base. I did not do any. I just shot straight downtown.
Yeah.
They like I mean, to do that when it's so encoded, like over and back, that is the job, right?
And I'm sure some of the people listening might have seen the movie Dunkirk. This was actually the larger sea lift than even that.
Great movie, by the way.
Full on, that movie was just, that's an intense movie, right? But the other thing that's interesting was the Dunkirk mythology was very much created to create a victor kind of, you know, narrative out of a pretty significant retreat, right?
Yeah.
And so when you actually go back, and I actually ended up writing about this for CNN, like if you go back and you look at the history, there are so many stories about Dunkirk that were not actually how, like, there were a number of civilian vessels, but many of them had been commandeered and were actually being captained or sailed or whatever by military folks, right? And then the others were just, there were some civilians involved, but it wasn't the same thing. It wasn't just, these people are not, this is not their job normally, and they just jumped to it. And there was no top-down, you know, the chain of command, obviously, you know this, right? It's hugely important. It's there for a reason. And honestly, the thing that was so cool that got disaster researchers to come and research this immediately after was the fact that this was not a chain of command situation.
It was instinctual.
Yes, and it
was organic.
Yeah.
And it worked so much better. Who knows? I mean, it was unplanned. So there was no system.
Right.
And people, there were no there were people who died jumping onto boats, right? But there was a tugboat captain who had a heart attack. But no boats flipped over. There were so many other things that could have gone wrong that didn't because of the professionalism of the mariners.
No matter what, it's considered a massive success. No other way
incredible,
to think of it.
Right? And honestly, you were asking like why these stories get untold or go untold for so long. One of the reasons I think, particularly with the maritime story, is that we have learned to just not pay attention to all this stuff over here, the water.
Why? Why do you think that?
Because it happened throughout history. Because this was, it used to be that all along, and this is where the history comes back, right? All along the waterfront, there was a working harbor that was front and center in everybody's view. Today, that is not the case. So if you go back to your apartment or your house or your whatever, almost everything in your home came from overseas. And some port workers had some involvement in them arriving in your home.
Yeah.
Do you see that? No. Most people don't see that work, specifically in New York Harbor, right? And so what happens is that it's sight unseen. People forget about the importance that this is a port, that this is how this how the city started, how Manhattan started, how the Dutch colony started, was because of the geography that created this port, right? So I can go deep into the weeds of the history, and I won't do that, I promise, but I'm a history nerd, and if anybody wants me to do that at some point, I'd be happy to do it, and I do it. But to keep it on focus, the history actually sort of repeated itself or had repercussions on the 11th. So a couple things. One is, so jumping ahead and then I'll jump back. When I was there, one of the most incredible things to see was that there was this, again, break bulk cargo kind of approach, because the other piece of what boats did was they brought supplies on. So they would drop off passengers on safer shores. They would load up with whatever supplies, huge bottles of water, first aid kits, whatever, and then they would come back on to Manhattan Island. So, and I'll break that down a little further, and I can't resist but do it now. I have been studying this and talked to so many people, and this is like a world that I have occupied for far too long, quite honestly, for mental health. And the photograph that still wrecks me every single time is this photograph that is taken from Staten Island, from where the Staten Island ferry docked, and it's a boat headed straight to the fucking island on fire. Mm-hmm. And you can see the columns of smoke. And that means that these captains, these boat crews, over and over again, dropped their passengers off and went back.
Yeah.
Right? And they not only went back, but they went back and they brought stuff. And then there was this whole after thing that happened, even after the boat lift, of supplying, of bringing family members down that ferry captains were involved in, and other people, and emergency responders, and all this other stuff. And a lot of people got sick because of that, over and over and over exposure. That
photo you're saying right now,
yeah.
It reminds me of a photo as well. You've probably seen it, Joe. You've probably seen it. Many of us have probably seen it. There's a photo taken, I guess it was on the Brooklyn side, of an FDNY ladder truck going over the Brooklyn Bridge towards the both towers on fire.
Yeah.
I don't want to get the company wrong, so I won't say it.
Yeah.
But they're going over the bridge to their fate. Unfortunately, every single member on that truck perished in the collapse.
Yeah.
And it's this really iconic photo. Mm-hmm. It's almost the same thing. I mean, the boat captain coming from Staten Island didn't die, but just knowing that they're going to hell, really. Yeah. It's what it was, right? They're going to hell, but they were still so courageous. And especially if you think about it, firefighters, cops, EMTs, military, when you sign up, you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, right?
Somewhat,
you go to the academy, you expect to face the worst.
Right.
So you're mentally prepared for it, or as best as you can be.
Right.
These boat captains, they that's not their job.
No.
But yet they still all did it. And I think that's the most amazing part of it.
Full on. And this is where things can get a little bit tricky. And my conversations, especially when it's like a first responder audience, I try to be really careful with this. But so often we create this divide, heroes and everybody else. And honestly, I think that's a terrible proposition for everybody, because the people who are in the hero category, it completely diminishes the real consequences, the real decisions that have to get made in that moment. It's like a call to duty, but it still has repercussions.
Yeah.
Your choice has repercussions for you, for your family, over and over again. And if we just put people in a little hero category, we diminish that human reality, right?
Yeah.
And it also does us a disservice if we think of people who are not in the hero category, because it's somehow they do that, not me. When the reality is that in this world that we occupy, we all have to step up.
Right.
We have to. And that's actually how disasters happen. Is that the first people who arrive, like disasters researchers, I don't do this research, but they have written about the fact that the first people who show up, because of the way we have it, is just regular people.
Yeah.
They're always there first, right? Because they're next door or whatever.
Yep.
And so because of that, if we wait for somebody to show up, it does a lot of bad things for a lot of reasons. One other piece that I want to say is that, yes, the boat crews were not trained to, execute a maritime evacuation of 500,000 people. And as part of getting my Coast Guard license, I had to take shipboard firefighting. I had to take all the safety and CPR and first aid and all that stuff. Because why? Because if you're on a boat, you don't just wait for someone to show up.
Yeah.
There's no ambulance coming.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually the ambulance piece is important, because especially the ferries. And again, because things got so bad down there, we forget how bad it was at the beginning, even when it was just an accident. the ferries immediately evacuated injured people. They served as floating ambulances because where the World Trade Center is, for people who aren't familiar with the geography, it's really, really close to the shoreline. And that was the fastest way, actually, to get people help was by boat to New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And there were triage centers that were set up all along New Jersey waterfront. And, as the morning went on, but there were more than 200 people who were injured, evacuated by boat, and many of them very early on.
Yeah. And little do we know that the first to actually come out of the Trade Center injured were, unfortunately, almost all of the injured.
Yes. Yes.
I don't want to get too much into the dynamics of the response, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of ambulances and EMTs and paramedics, nurses, doctors who were setting up triage centers, not just in Lower Manhattan, but like as you said, Jersey, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens, Long Island, everywhere. Every single hospital in the tri-state area was preparing to receive thousands of patients, and it just never happened.
Yeah, they just never showed up.
Because, as we all know now, everyone perished for the most part. So those first few hundred that came out of the Trade Center were probably the only few hundred that were essentially injured, quote unquote, in the entire attack.
It just shows you how important that service was. And so these mariners applied that training that they had received. They used their first aid kits that they had on board. There were people who were really just devastatingly burned. There were people with glass shards in them. There were people with clothes melted onto their bodies. Really, really intense stuff that the mariners, they're not EMTs,
right,
but they had some bit of training, right? And the idea is that the whole mode of working on a boat is everything's fine until it's not.
Yeah.
And that's just how it works.
Yeah.
And so that sort of, I don't want to say trigger point, but like that moment of click into action is really ingrained by what the job is in a way. And so certainly people rose to the challenges that were just completely unfathomable for most people in ways that were really creative, resourceful, using everything that they had. The fact that they had nothing, they would use that, it was just really, really incredible. And it's a piece of the professionalism of mariners that it was possible.
Bringing this back to Harvey, September 11th, do we know how many people this boat had help evacuate?
Yeah, I think it was about 100, 150 people, which is definitely more than we like to typically carry. And so what happened was the boat went down and basically evacuated passengers. And as Tim Ivory would tell the story with a chuckle, because he's a Jersey boy, he said, "Okay, we're going to New Jersey," and nobody wanted to get on the boat. I don't know if this is actually true. He'll be mad at me if he hears this. Anyway, so nobody wanted to get on the boat, and then they're like, "Okay, fine, we'll go to Manhattan further north," and everybody got on the boat. So they get on the boat, and while the Harvey is going north, basically to evacuate passengers, and the idea is, okay, what are we going to do? This is what we're going to do. What also happens simultaneously is that he was then a captain, and then since rose through the ranks and is now retired, Tommy White. So he had ended up borrowing a boat. So again, boats, right? Borrowing a boat from Hastings-on-Hudson and coming down to help, right? He's FDNY, and he wasn't on duty, and he reported for duty. And
sorry, as you're talking, there is a massive Carnival Magic cruise ship going by, so we're gonna get a massive wake in a moment from that thing.
It'll probably take a while for it to get here.
Yeah. Sorry, just caught my attention. This gigantic boat just driving right by your head.
I know, it's so weird that you're like looking out, and I'm just like, I'm only looking at your blue eyes. I had to point that out.
I'm sorry. It's not every day that I'm sitting on a boat when the Carnival Magic just drives right by.
Well, if Bob were here, he'd be like, "Fire up engines, we're going to go shoot water." Because he loved chasing cruise ships.
That's awesome.
Totally.
Yeah.
Where the hell was I?
So
so evacuating passengers.
Yeah.
So Tommy White reports for duty, basically. And he's arriving on the site. I mean, it is, as we all know, right? It's just ash and destruction, and the smell, and just everything is snow covered, and it's just really intense. And he arrives, and there are all these firefighters just with this look on their faces, and they're walking out from the site, and he's like, "There's no water, there's no water, there's no water." And Tommy White's is like, "Wait a minute, okay." So he had worked upon the FDNY in the Marine Division, right? And so he has that concept of the limited, unlimited supply of water. So that is taking place, but everybody needs more. All the hydrants had been either buried or the water mains are broken. So there's no water to fight these raging fires. Even after the towers came down, as you know, there were like real fires going on there.
I think a lot of people who aren't from the New York area, or even those who are, I guess, outside of the emergency services, they don't realize the amount of fire that was still raging, because when you look at photos from the aerial photos of the collapse, you actually don't really see the fires.
Yes.
You see smoke.
Yeah.
But it's also mixed in with all the dust.
Yeah.
There was so much. I don't think people realize, first off, how far down the trade centers went. So when you were standing street level at the trade center, that wasn't the base of the trade center, right?
No.
It still went all the way down. It had it had subways. I mean, it was. I don't even know how. I don't even want to say how far down it went, but it went very far down.
Yeah.
So when these towers came down on top of the massive hole that they were already on, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of feet of just mangled steel that was essentially entrapping these massive raging fires.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to help paint a picture a little bit better for those of you who don't really know. And these fires were raging for months.
I think it was like 4 months.
Yeah.
There were still raging fires down there. I mean, at a certain point, things were more contained because it's a raging fire in that giant hole, like you were talking about. But even before that, early on, straight away, right at the beginning, there were like dumpsters on fire, buildings on like big. Any other day would have been a huge fire, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no water, and so Tommy White sees this fireboat. You know, not really. He's like, hey, can that boat pump water? That's what we need to do, not evacuate passengers, right? And so he sends a message, and it's a big, long story in terms of how, like, and then the little police boat is like chasing the Harvey down and saying, you know, come back. So drop off passengers, go back to pump water. And while Tommy White is there and is like, can you pump water? And Tim Ivory's like, yes. And he's like, what do you need to make this happen? And Tim's like, you know, fuel is expensive. It is even more expensive now, but it was pretty expensive then. And he's like, I can pump for like, 15 minutes or something like that, because we're always running on empty. It's a not-for-profit.
Yeah.
And so we arranged to get fuel loaded on. But basically, Tim Ivory can tell the story better of how he rigged up so the turrets were not functional. He couldn't get the valves open. He had people working on it the whole time. And so what he had to do is basically get New York Thread, current day New York Thread hose lines onto the deck pipes. So taking off the nozzles and getting that rigged up, and he was able to do that. And it was really a remarkable feat of engineering. And his gravestone is going to say that Timmy he can get any piece of shit working.
So essentially, the FDNY sees this boat, and they go, "We're commandeering this boat. We need you to pump water down to."
They didn't commandeer. They're like, "Hey, can you come help?" I mean, and that's the other thing, right? Like, it's like it's not a top-down thing.
When I say commandeer, I knew that, so they didn't actually come on board because they didn't even know how to pump it themselves, right? Because this boat is so old.
Right.
But they said, we need you, right? They sent a police boat to come get you.
Yes,
and say, turn back around.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, and it was a group of people. Even so, Bob Lenny also arrived on the 12th. So that first day was there was no FDNY, there was no, Tommy White was the contact, right? And he would, there was this whole configuration of, the problem is not volume, right? When you're working with the river, but the problem is pressure. And so there were burned out pumpers that would end up being the go-between, and so there were different lines and Tim was using soapstone to like mark on the side of the boat what line was going where so they could turn it off, right? Because that's a huge, you got to be able to turn it off and turn it on, right? Yeah. So that whole thing gets worked out with a bunch of people who were, the closest thing to firefighters. Tim Ivory was a volunteer and nobody else was, right? And it was just a get it done kind of attitude. And they got it done. And this boat pumped water until Friday.
Wow.
And it was the only water, that and the active duty boats was the only water that was available down there for firefighting.
And on the 12th, how did you end up getting on the boat? How did you work your way down here?
So I called first thing in the morning on the 12th, and I called Huntley's phone, and Tim answered. And I was like, where are you? And he's like, where do you think we are? And I'm like, how do I get there?
Yeah.
You know? And so Bob had just arrived. And so he, the FDNY guy was like, this is what you do. Go to the Marine Division. I'm in Brooklyn. So it was Brooklyn Navy Yard. That's where it's stationed. And he said, go there, do this, talk to this person. And that's what I did. I immediately just, went, got down to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And, I remember that, that feeling that everybody had of wanting to help, just like, it wasn't even wanting to help. It was just like, it was painful.
Mm-hmm.
It was just excruciating to not be able to do anything. And so I go down to the Navy Yard, and there are these merchant mariners in this little, go fast boat basically. And I walk down there, and I'm not that big a person and everybody in FDNY, like pretty much across the board, is a lot bigger than me, right? So this little person, arriving, and these guys, these big guys, these merchant mariners are like chuck their sandwich, like they're on lunch break or whatever, and they chuck their sandwiches down, and they're like, okay, because I could finally go
do something,
right? And so everybody had that feeling, and that's how I got there.
Their mission was getting you to your mission.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But everybody was just so desperate to just, God, there's got to be something like the feeling of uselessness is, that's the thing that still haunts me.
And after getting on the boat, you have 6 months working on the ship?
Yeah.
And to start working and pumping it in that situation, what was that like for you?
My brain was broken, honestly. That's honestly what happened. My brain was broken. And I the good news is that, that because everything was kind of set up, it was more about maintaining. And so we had to swap over pumping operations from one of the engines because we had to repack the pumps, which is going to get too deep in the weeds for a lot of your audience. But in any case, it's a job that I had done before. And so Tim was like, hey, I need you to do this, shut down engines, swap things over. So pumping. Anyway, I did the shit backwards. I was down there, and I like so much
did it reverse engineering.
I just literally, the piece was, I don't even know how to explain it, but the piece was backwards. And not only did I do it backwards, but I was like, I had Tim come down and check my work, and he just looked at me like, oh, okay. Because it was so disorienting. I had just arrived, right? And I'm arriving to this lunar landscape, and it was just this blur. Everybody's in uniform. I'm not, I'm just this person, right? And feeling so just completely overwhelmed by the circumstances. And there's just this blur of different colors of the uniforms, and it just seems like everybody's moving with purpose. And I show up, and I was so glad that he gave me a job, but it was down in the engine room, and I could have been anywhere.
Yeah.
And I felt so discombobulated. I wish there was a better word for it. But
right.
So he looked at me, he looked at the job I did, and he was like, we need to go for a walk. And then I came back and I did the job.
Just to clear your head.
Yeah, just because I immediately arrived and then went down there, the place that I'd rather be any other, that is the place where I wanted to be most on the planet at that moment in my life. And and I just couldn't bear being there because I just couldn't put together what was real and what was happening, Yeah.
So essentially, in the most unofficial way possible, the FDNY kind of deputized this boat and the crew and said, here you go, giving you the cross. You're now FDNY, Marine firefighters.
Full on.
And like you said, you show up, you're surrounded by all these people that are supposed to know what they're doing, right? You get there.
And just to be fair, I assumed, I had this, it was just sort of delusional. I assumed oh, okay, well, they got this.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because you're trained to think that somebody's going to have to know how to figure the shit out. And it's okay, you have a fancy uniform, you must know what's going on.
I would say for the most part, they do. But again, taking it back to this boat was built in 1931, right?
Yeah.
This boat is older than by decades, all of them.
Right.
And then it had been decommissioned for a few years prior.
Yeah.
And even before that, it was a reserve, piece of apparatus.
Yeah.
So, this boat hadn't been touched probably for years by any member of the FDNY. Essentially just maybe to maintain it, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So you're their first responder, right? You're their saving grace.
Full on. And that's really what happened, was that sort of reality check.
It's a lot of stress to put on somebody too, who has no training.
And what a fucking privilege.
Oh, well, of course.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's honestly
And
how
the
I
bigger
took it
aspect
in.
of it.
Yeah, like
But-
it wasn't, I didn't feel it as pressure. I really felt it as a total privilege.
But
to
just
be able
going back,
to-
so this podcast, we also focus a lot
Yeah.
on the mental health aspect,
Yeah.
right? And you're fully versed into that
Yeah.
world as well. You're saying that you knew what you were doing. You got on this boat, but
Yeah.
you did everything backwards because you were in such a head fog.
Yeah.
Because there was so much going around.
Yeah.
But the boat pilot, right? He was the pilot of the
Yes.
boat. He had enough intuition to understand that you were going through something at the time, even when everything else is going on downtown, where we've just lost thousands of people.
Yeah.
Hundreds of firefighters, police officers are now dead.
Yeah.
He still took the time to say, okay, you know what? Let's take a second. Let's get off the boat. Let's go for a walk. Let's clear your mind. And it worked.
The take a second thing, it's just, this is the thing that is, I mean, I'm so driven and pretty obsessive when it comes to trying to figure out how trauma literally happens in your body. Because so often, and the episode that just, what's the word? Opened up today that you just posted today.
Okay, yeah.
Right? You were talking, or your guest was talking about how, in the military, it's like, oh, you get PTSD, you're weak, right? I mean, don't get me started, but the fact is, the thing that we really need to wrap our heads around, and it took me a long time. I couldn't, especially as a woman in this job, I could not admit my PTSD. And what was actually the person who actually made it possible for me to get to that point was my chief engineer, who way bigger than me. We would show up, we would do these talks to fire departments all over who wanted to, do like an after incident report kind of thing, or, just try to learn from the experience. And he would say to this group of other firefighters, all guys, like, hey, PTSD is full on, it's real, it's nothing to be ashamed of, get help.
Yeah.
So
you're referring to, it's episode 4 that was released today with Matthias Ferreira.
Oh, I'm sorry, right?
No,
Because
it's
the
fine,
timing's going to be all different.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So
Thank you.
Today, as in the day we're shooting this podcast, we released episode 4
Right.
called, what was it?
Embrace the Suck.
Embrace the Suck.
Which I
I
thought was
love
an
it.
amazing
Yes.
title.
Yes.
And what Matthias was saying, for those of you who haven't seen it, you should have watched it by now, by the way. But if
Or you should now.
Yeah, you should now. If you go back and watch it if you haven't, or listen to it. He was referring to being and it's actually very relatable to September 11th,
Yeah.
right? Being in an active war zone.
Yeah.
When you have bullets whizzing over your head, you don't have the time to decompartmentalize what's actually occurring.
Right.
After the incident even had occurred, of him losing, friends, and then even he himself stepping on the pressure plate and losing both of his legs, there was no time to actually take that second and try to relax your mind, because you're still in that active war zone.
Right.
And then once you actually get back over, to the States or to Germany where he felt safer, then you can start thinking, okay, what the fuck just happened to me, or what happened to my friend who 5 minutes before I was talking to, and now they're deceased because they got shot,
Right.
or they stepped on an IED.
Right.
The same could easily be said for what was occurring on 9/11. I mean, we here in the city didn't know what was going on, even after the towers came down, and you have, like a bomb had went off, or it's a war zone. We don't know, are there more planes coming?
Right.
Is another bomb going to go off? Is somebody going to attack somewhere else in the city?
Right.
So,
And during a critical incident, you fall back on your training and your job.
Right.
You do your job to the best of your ability, and you put everything else out of your mind. It's not till after days, weeks, months, maybe even years later where it starts materializing, like, oh shit, that happened. I know personally there was calls when I was working as a critical care EMT where in the moment you do your job, you don't even recognize as the person there as a person. You're there like, this is my job. I got to do this to stabilize them. And then later on, it's like, oh shit, did that really just happen?
Yeah.
When was it for you? How long afterwards was it that you were like, the realization, like, oh shit, did I really just do that? Did that happen? How long did that realization take for you?
Well, I think the best way to answer it is what happened on, I believe it was Thursday. So on Thursday, there was no building actually came down, so we can't peg it to actual timeline, and it's kind of all a blur. But at a certain point, I was on land and I was helping to organize supplies. So all these boats are bringing in all these supplies, but it's just a pile of crap, and there's dust everywhere, and people are coming and looking for flashlights, hard hats, eye wash, right, which was really batteries, gloves, all this stuff, and no one could find it. And so I was helping to sort through supplies. I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can help. I can do this. So I'm sorting through supplies, which, I was glad to be able to do it. And all of a sudden there was this mad stampede down to the waterfront because there was a rumor that another building was going to come down, which, as you know, at that time is like, absolutely, it's going to come down.
Right.
Like there was no question.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy, right? It was, anything was possible. Mm-hmm. And we really didn't know what the escalation was going to be. So, which is really hard for people now to understand, like that just, this is so unheard of. Anything is possible.
Right.
And whatever is coming is not going to be good, right? That feeling. So I immediately dashed to the boat, but I'm caught up in this stampede. People are falling. And of course, back to the history thing, because because Manhattan basically turned its back on its waterfronts and then only sort of reconnected with the waterfront in a recreational way, there are all these railings that curve inland. Right. And so, in fact, one of the fire department boats actually cut a section of railing out so they could frickin' operate. Right. It was ridiculous. So there's no fendering. There's no place for big boats to tie up. There's no bollards. There's no infrastructure when it absolutely would have been there decades earlier. Right. So the fact that there's no infrastructure actually killed people that day. Yeah. That's full on, right? Real. And what it meant on this, not actually a building coming down, was that the stampede is happening and there are all these lines. We literally tied to trees down there. We were tied to trees. And so not only is that bad because across the walkway are all these huge ropes, but the other thing is you can't release them quickly. So it's like a panic, full on panic, people in full turnout gear jumping in the water. Wow. Clambering down ladders. Like it was like this building is coming down. And so in that moment, I got on the boat and I'm like reaching up and I'm grabbing, like helmets and, helping people get on board. And there was a big drop. And again, no proper docking infrastructure. People are taking a ladder, but that's too slow. And I get on board and I look up at Bob and I look at Tim and I look up at Bob again. And Bob says, and just points his thumb very gently to the engine room. It's like that training, he's just like, it's not that he's not affected, but he is in that mode. He's got decades of doing this kind of work, right? Although the circumstances that day were pretty extraordinary. So he gestures and I know exactly what I need to do. And I go down in the engine room and I fire up the 271 and I fire up this engine, I fire up that engine and I get to my place and I'm dinging and, and I'm there and I'm right where I'm supposed to be. Because this I know how to do. And that was the moment for me. And then I was like, I'm not supposed to be on land. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is what this boat is for. This is what I can do.
Going back to the pumping situation, you said, the Harvey and maybe a handful of other boats were supplying water down to downtown Manhattan where the trade centers were. Yeah. How long did this boat pump for, and how much water do you think actually came from this boat down to the trade center?
God, I don't even know how you'd begin to quantify. I mean, it would probably be a very long, complicated math problem.
Let's do it.
Yeah, but we're going to make him do it. He's doing all the math for us today. Yeah. But it's basically from Tuesday to Friday. I mean, that's what happened.
Nonstop.
Yeah. I mean, there would be periods where we would shift things over. There were periods where we had to cover for one of the other FDNY active duty boats that had a bunch of problems. We would have to fix things underway. And I remember like running to the pilot boat in New York to borrow a wrench or whatever, and everybody worked together. People were literally carrying buckets of diesel fuel, open buckets of diesel fuel, which is very much against the rules.
There's no rules.
Everybody's wondering.
But there was no rules at that point.
But you know what? What's so interesting to me, and one of my favorite quotes from all the interviews I did for this book was from then Lieutenant Mike Day, who's now he's got so much brass on his jacket he probably walks crooked, right? Because he's really risen and he's a remarkable person. He is the person who is on site, like the top brass on site, and he did not come in and take over. He totally came in with a like, what can I do to help kind of mentality, right? And that was the thing that worked. I mean, it worked brilliantly. Everyone was just like, okay, what's the problem? Okay, we got to do it. Okay, we don't have a gangway. People are docking giant boats in all kinds of different places that they don't belong.
It's great that people were able to put their egos to the side.
Totally.
And that's very rare when it comes to the emergency services field. People of all ranks, doesn't chief down to down to the probationary firefighters or police officers, whatever you want to say. Our egos get in the way so much, and we instinctually always want to be the hero. We want to be in charge.
Right.
So for them to be able to say, you know what, these guys, even though they're quote unquote civilians, know what they're doing, we're going to let them handle it, is phenomenal and amazing and almost unbelievable to begin with, because that typically doesn't happen.
But you know why? It wasn't that people set their egos aside. It's that people's egos were absolutely fucking obliterated by the unprecedentedness.
Yeah.
And that's actually the most beautiful part of the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I mean, my book has so many harrowing stories, and it messed me up to talk about these stories over and over and over again for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And it messed people up, right? And it's not a story about horrors. It's a story about how people were just so essentially human that they didn't let ego or not having the right equipment or any of these other trappings get in the way, because there were other humans who needed help, period. And so it's almost like it cut away so much bullshit that helps us, there's so much that helps us or that doesn't help us, like gets in the way of us doing our best work, right? And ego is a very big one, right? There's a place for the chain of command. I'm not, contradicting that, but there are other ways that things have to get done sometimes. And, and honestly, it's a testament to the Coast Guard that they did not come in and pull rank. Mm-hmm. It's a testament to FDNY that they did not, but they were absolutely just decimated. I mean, all the leadership died. I mean, that's going to change the way things operate. And it's horrible, and it also allows us to think bigger about who and how we can be, and that's I hope what the lasting lessons are, is that people can re-envision what is possible, how they can help, whatever you can do, whatever it is that you can do, you can actually do it.
Well, you answered one of my questions just now. So no, it's fine. One of the ways we typically end the podcast, even though we're not ending it now, but one of the typical ways we do it is we say, what's the takeaway? If you can give a recommendation, or if for those who are listening, what's like the bigger picture? I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head on that one.
To me, what is really just every day, I mean, I cover things that actually happen, right? I'm a nonfiction reporter. That's what's interesting to me. It's just, it never ceases to amaze me, the capacity that people have, right? And we are so much bigger and more capable of helping other people than we give ourselves credit for very often. And there's so often it's just like programming that gets in the way, right? There's programming that's really good because it'll help you just, this is the triage. I gotta the trachea, like whatever it is, like boom, 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 get down your list, right? That is good programming. But there's also programming that helps or that creates this desensitization, and then we miss the fact that these are humans. Like there was no question about letting everybody on your boat. It wasn't like, do you have a hand stamp, or like, where are you from, or like, okay, who did you vote for?
Are you vaccinated?
Right there, we're at such a divided time that's why I feel like these stories, especially in the focus that I tried to put on in doing all these interviews and putting this information together, it is how we actually come together. It is what is actually possible, how we can be, who we can be. And that's the message that I really hope carries through.
What happened after the Harvey was done pumping on the Friday?
So what happened was, I think we were sort of relinquished from duty like midday or maybe late morning or something. And then we couldn't go anywhere because the president was coming. And so the president, the whole harbor was shut down. And there was this, so we were, along the seawall, tied up, and there were boats who were tied to us because everybody just sort of stacked along the shoreline because there was no facility to actually be tied up well. And so there was this tugboat, and it was the stern deck was full of firefighters who had just been there for a really long time, and they were all sitting on the stern deck. Obviously, this is not it's a tugboat. It's not a passenger vessel. So people are just like sitting on coiled line or, on whatever they could. And then there's the announcement that the harbor shut down, and everybody, like, you could just see the just like deflated, like, people are cooked, and people have been there for so many hours. And so I remember looking over, talk about like, what can you do? Right. I looked over, and then Tommy White was on board our boat, and I said, Tommy, we have all this beer from our Hudson River trip. Do you think they'd like it? And he's like, I think they would love it. And so I walked over and I brought this beer to all these firefighters, and it's just whatever. It's stupid and it's beer, it's whatever. But like, it was just this big hurrah erupted, like people are desperate for any kind of levity, like,
recreation,
or humanity, or like
bringing them back to normal just for a slight moment,
right? That laughter that comes from the dark places, kind of, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I was like, I'm sorry, I don't have any ice. And then these two guys go up and they're like, we'll find ice, and they like went on board because we're all just stuck in the harbor, right?
Yeah.
No one can go home, and so they go and they find ice and buckets and the whole thing, and everyone's like, rah, and it wasn't. No one was making light of what was going on, but it was all just like, oh, I'm alive right now.
Yeah.
You're alive. We're alive. What can we do? What can we do to help each other get through this thing? And that, I'll never forget that moment of the firefighters in their full turnout gear, like on the back of the boat, just silhouetted with this pink sky, And I was just like, that's all I had. That's all I had was some warm beer. And it still, made a tiny difference. That's all we could ever do.
Probably made a bigger difference than you could actually imagine.
The analogy for me is that the way that debris came off the pile, especially in the early days, was bucket by bucket in these long bucket brigades. And it was just a little bit. And everybody was being very careful. We were still looking for people. And that's all that anybody really had to contribute in that situation, was just a tiny little bit at a time. And, that doesn't assuage any of the guilt that I still carry from the fact that I couldn't fix it,
But it's almost like putting a puzzle together, right?
Yeah.
You take all these tiny little pieces.
Yes.
So that your beer was that little piece that needed to be added to the puzzle.
And that's all I had,
It's all you needed.
That's all I had.
That's all you needed.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what I'm saying. I think you may have had a bigger effect on those firefighters than what you think.
I'll take it. I mean, it was shitty beer. It was
Who
why
cares?
it was left,
Doesn't
right?
matter. It doesn't matter.
No, I mean, I'll take it because, the pain of not being able to make everything okay is just, it's awful.
So I want to end the podcast or get towards the end of the podcast with this. So this unbelievable scene just occurred for the past few days. You just did something probably I assume you could have never imagined that you were going to do.
No.
You get home. What's life like after that?
I was not in a good place for a very long time. I feel like the world divided into people who were there and people who weren't. Not in a like power trippy kind of way, but like probably the way that my grandfather felt, who served in 3 different wars. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what happened. Can't talk about it, right? But you already know. And so this boat was kind of the only thing that made sense, and being down in the engine room was perfect because it's just engines blaring and you can't talk. It's perfect. It was perfect for me because I just couldn't, it took, I was going to say years, but I think it was at least a decade before I could talk about this at all. Like at all.
Do you mind if I ask, did you go to therapy? Did you do anything besides just working here on the boat to try to, ease your mind?
Well, ease my mind. That never happens. I've never been a very easy-minded person. No, just to be fair, right?
Yeah.
But I did. I actually, I'm involved in the God, I'm totally blanking what it's called, but the research project, the World Trade Center Health Research Project,
Okay.
right? And so they ask you these questions, right? And they're asking the questions like, oh my God, all the answers are yes, right? Which in a not a good way. And yeah, I ended up doing a whole lot of drinking and then, getting a bunch of just, I don't know, like talk therapy or whatever, and trying to learn, right? Trying to learn, because the thing, and I didn't get to this earlier, but I think it's really important to me, and I don't know who's making it to the end of the podcast, but this is the thing I really care about, which is that we misconstrue trauma or after effects as weakness. And the fact is that it's literally encoded in your body. You don't get to choose. Like it literally is in your body. And if the more we can normalize that and just recognize that that's actually what like you're not like, oh, I think I'm going to be weak today. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, I think I'm going to have a meltdown because it's September 10th. Or for me, every fucking time I look at the clock, still, it's always 9/11. It's not 9/10. It's not 9/12. It's over and over and over again. And, I have people in my life who are like, it's just a time.
I think so for those who are hearing the whistling and the cheering, it sounds like there's a plane flying overhead with a specific flag. I don't want to get into politics, but I assume that's what it's for.
Okay.
So I think that's probably what they're cheering for. For those who have been through something similar that you've been through, this really traumatic event, doing these public talks, because I know you've done a lot of them.
Yeah.
Moving forward, does it help at all?
I want to be nice and say yes.
No. We want you to be honest.
Yeah, honestly, it sucks. It doesn't. I mean, I don't know. Maybe like if someone objectively could look down from above on me and say, yeah, it helps you. Like, it doesn't feel like it. I've been sick all day. Honestly.
Yeah.
Quite like
thinking of this podcast.
Absolutely.
So we appreciate you even coming out here and doing this.
I feel like it's my moral responsibility to talk about this boat, to talk about all of the mariners, the people, the vessels that came together, and to give this picture of what is actually possible about how we can actually be with each other and not so divided, like we can really actually recognize each other's humanity. And for me, that's the thing that drives me. And I've been totally nauseous all day in advance of this podcast because I hate talking about this. It took me a really long time to be able to do it. But what is more important than my discomfort is the truth about this history. And I feel like it's my job.
I think it kind of goes back full circle to how we originally began the podcast. We said the reason that you feel that you want to be here in the first place is because you want to make sure that these stories continue.
Yes.
And people understand exactly what happened on that day. Because again, there's tens of thousands, if not more, stories from that day. And every single one is completely different.
Yes.
But this one in particular, I think is so special. I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody else.
Yeah.
But I think this boat, your story, I think the whole thing as a whole, just in general, because like I was saying, we have other stories lined up for the next few weeks.
Yeah.
When I heard about this and when I had done my slight research, because for those of you who aren't really in the podcasting world, you have to do research.
Yeah.
Because you want to know who you're interviewing. But at the same time, you have to walk that fine line. You don't want to read too much because then you know too much going into the podcast.
Right.
And you don't want to make the podcast seem like it's just a straight up interview. You want to almost make it seem like it's a conversation. And that's kind of what the muster room is. It's a bunch of first responders sitting around a table just shooting the shit, asking these tough questions because these aren't easy for you to answer. And you can tell, especially what you just said to me. Yeah. But it's such a special, important story that needs to get out there. So I truly appreciate you being here. I know Joe certainly appreciates it. Eric, who's listening from home right now because he couldn't make it, he appreciates it. But before we end the podcast,
I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
If people want to learn more, and you said you wrote 2 books, what are they called and where can people find them?
Okay, so the easiest thing is to go to my website, which is www.jessicadulong.com. And that has links to everything. But the 2 books are Saved at the Seawall, Stories from the September 11th Boat Lift, and My River Chronicles, Rediscovering the Work that Built America. And that's where all the history nerd stuff comes out.
And I'm a big history buff, so I will definitely be reading the book for sure. I'm
Awesome.
a big history buff. I think that kind of actually leads into the final question.
Yes.
As part of the podcast, we always ask our guests to
Yes.
bring a piece of themselves that they're willing to part ways with, something that is important and means something to them, but that they're willing to give to the Muster Room podcast, where we will then in turn add it to our collection of trinkets and other items that all of our guests give us
Yes.
to create a living museum.
Yes.
Once we establish a base for
home
our
base,
home base for our podcast. So, what did you bring us today?
Well, I brought you copies of my books right here, which I will autograph for you if
Please.
you would like, because the thing that I honestly, the thing I'll probably autograph, the thing that I really appreciate about what you guys are doing is that you are really creating the space for people to give voice to the unspoken. And I think that is crucial. And as hard as it is, there's no hierarchy of trauma, right? Everybody
No.
has their stories, and, nobody's is, harder, more important than the other. But instead, it's a space to be able to talk through the aftermath. It's really important. It's really, really important. So I appreciate what you guys are doing.
And we appreciate everything that you've done and continue to do.
Thank you.
It's amazing. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question for you. Do you mind taking us on a tour of the boat?
I don't mind at all. I'd love to.
All right, so let's go do that.
Okay.
All right, so Joe, take it away.